Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Daniel J. Lasker, who is a retired professor of Jewish thought at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And we will be discussing his newest book, brand new book, called Karaism, an introduction to the oldest surviving alternative Judaism, and is published by the Lippman Library of Jewish Civilization. Thank you, Professor Lasker, for joining me.
Well, thank you, Nachi, for having me.
My pleasure. So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I did all my degrees at Brandeis University, majoring undergraduate in philosophy and Near Eastern Judaic Studies, and a master's and PhD in Near Eastern Judaic Studies, Nedges, in which I studied medieval Jewish philosophy mainly. When I finished, even before I finished my doctorate, I started teaching in colleges in America. I was teaching for 5 years in America and then moved to Israel in 1978, went straight to Ben Gurion University of the Negev, and I've been here since the last 44 years.
Okay, so when and how did your interest in Karaism start?
Well, when I was studying at Brandeis, my doctoral advisor, and even before he was my advisor, was Professor Alexander Altman, who was one of the major scholars of the 20th century in Jewish studies in general, but mostly medieval Jewish studies. And the first course I took with him was classical Jewish commentaries. And among other commentaries, he sent us to Aaron ben Elijah's Keter Torah, which was a Karaite commentary. And he obviously treated the Karaites as part of the Jewish tradition and of interest to compare with the rabbinites. Rabbinites are followers of rabbinic Judaism in the context of Karaism. So it started out then, and in my doctoral dissertation, which was on philosophical polemics against Christianity, I used Karaite sources in Judeo-Arabic, like Yaqub al-Kirkasani, Yusuf al-Basir, and one of the more important Karaite authors, at least known in the rabbinic world, is Isaac of Troki and his anti-Christian polemic. So I started using those materials, and then I continued reading Karaite works. And one of the things I noticed was the inadequacies of previous scholarship, that most people who dealt with Karaites just quoted one after another. They didn't understand that there was progress or change in Karaism over the 1200 years. And then in the last 30 years, the former Soviet Union became available, especially the Furkovich collections, and it just totally enriched Karaite studies, that it became more and more central to my study and more central to Jewish studies. It used to be that when we wrote an article about Karaism, it always was, unfortunately, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, the collections are not available. Now, in a sense, when one writes an article or book, one has to say, unfortunately, they are available, but it'll take years and years, decades of indexing and cataloging to know exactly what's there. So over the years, I've looked at these texts, saw that there was much more there than usually is given credit, and I thought that it was important to bring this to the attention of the scholarly world.
Okay, and you mentioned Furkovich and his collection. I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's start off with, tell the listeners. I mean, I'm sure people probably are familiar somewhat with Karaites, what they are, and they're probably more familiar with Tzedukim. They heard of Tzedukim, which is similar. So what are, I guess, give a broad view of what a Karaite is and when it started and how it started, just for the listeners who may not be familiar, or even those who may be familiar.
Okay, so first of all, you mentioned the Tzedukim, or the Sadducees. The Sadducees were a group in the Second Temple about which we know only from the writings of their opponents, the Pharisees, which is us. So it's a little perhaps misleading. We also have the Dead Sea Scroll people who seem to have a halacha, which was nice near the Sadducees, but their ideology was different. In the Middle Ages, rabbinic Jews, the rabbinites, were accustomed to calling the Karaites Sadducees because one of the hallmarks of the Tzedukim was that they didn't accept the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah. And since the Karaites also didn't accept the oral Torah, it was natural to call them Tzedukim. The Karaites, however, were very upset by this, and they understood that another aspect of sadduceeism, according to rabbinic sources, is a rejection of reward and punishment in the world to come. And the Karaites are strong believers in reward and punishment in the world to come, and therefore they say they're not connected to the Sadducees. It's a little bit unclear, and one of the major issues I deal with in my book is there any relation between the Karaites and what the Second Temple different groups? There are a number of things which are in common between the groups, but there's no way of proving a continuity. And there's also the possibility that some of the Dead Sea Scroll influence on Karaism was a result of the discovery of the scrolls, some scrolls around the year 800. We have evidence of this. And it's possible that they just adopted some of the things that were in the scrolls. So Karaism is not a Second Temple group as such. It has perhaps relationship, has things in common with the Second Temple groups, but it's not in the Second Temple. Karaism itself was started in the 9th century, as far as we can tell. Usually it's considered the 8th century, Anan ben David. This is the name that everybody knows. Anybody knows anything about Karaism knows about Anan ben David and about how he wanted to be exilarch, and he was passed over for his younger brother, and he revolted, and he got in trouble with the caliph, and he created a new religion. But Anan's religion was really Ananism, the followers of Ananiah, the followers of Anan. And it was only 100, 200 years later with the Karaites who adopted him as one of theirs. But until then, Ananites and Karaites were separate groups. And also in the Second Temple period, there were other, not the Second Temple period, the Islamic period, the 8th century, 9th century. There were a number of other groups, some Messianic groups, some with other founders. All these groups disappeared except for Karaism. So we really can trace back Karaism, as we know it today, to the 9th century in the Middle East. Maybe it began in Persia, the Iran of today. Anan himself was from Bavel, Iraq. And one of the theories about the founding of Karaism is that it was communities which had their own customs, which are far away from the center in Iraq and Bavel and the Gonim. And when the Gonim tried to impose upon them the Talmud and the Talmudic way of doing things, they said, wait, that's not our traditions. So Karaite origins is a very, very difficult thing to determine. We'll never know for sure. But if you want to know when this group was an identifiable group as Baalei Mikra or B'nai Mikra, that's in the middle of the 9th century in Persia.
Okay, so you're saying, so basically Anan is considered, like you're saying, he has to do with it, but he's not necessarily you're saying he's not the founder of Karaism as we know it.
He's not the founder of Karaism, and also Anan's laws were very different than future Karaite laws. Not altogether, there are certain things in common, the non-use of candles or fire on Shabbat, some of the laws of a forbidden relationship. But for instance, Anan interpreted the prohibition of cooking a calf in its mother's milk, as having to do with the first fruits and nothing having to do with animals. And Karaites didn't accept it. They didn't accept the prohibition of milk and meat, but they didn't understand the way Anan understood it. Anan had other thought that circumcision, Brit Milah, had to be done with scissors. And Anan had a number of different concluded laws that he had in his Book of Commandments, which were not accepted by the Karaites. And then the Ananites became associated with the Karaites later.
So I want to get more into the ideology, but once we're at this point, I want to just mention Rav Sadducees is famous for, I think, fighting against them. I mean, he was fighting with the Karaites or with the Ananites? Who was he busy with, fighting with?
Well, he has a book, Al-Rad al-Anan, the answer to Anan, but he has a number of other anti-Karaite works. He has a poem called Esa Mishali, which in one manuscript says it's against Ben Asher, and then there's a big controversy. Is this Ben Asher the Masoret, or is it Ben Asher, another Ben Asher? What's interesting about Saadia is that in rabbinic historiography, Saadia is seen as the hero who fought back against Karaism, that he was the one who put his finger in the dike. Otherwise, Karaites would have overrun the Jewish world, and we'd be talking today not about the Karaites, but about a small group of rabbinites who didn't eat milk and meat together or lit Shabbos candles and things like that. But if we look at Karaism in the time of Saadia, his contemporary, a fellow named Yaqub al-Kirkasani in Baghdad, along with Saadia, wrote in his major book of law, and it's not only law, but much about the culture and civilization of Karaism and what was going on at the time. He wrote that no two Karaites agreed about anything, and the situation became worse from day to day. So it's very possible that what happened is until the time of Saadia and Kirkasani, there were these various groups, there were Karaites, but it wasn't clear what the distinctions were between the groups. The boundary lines were somewhat porous. Comes Saadia and says, look, fellows, you're either with us or you're with them. And part of the problem with them is they themselves can't decide what they're doing. So the Karaites said, well, wait, okay, let's get our act together. Let's standardize the law and our interpretations of the Torah and ideology and theology. And therefore, it's very possible that it was Saadia who, in a sense, unified the Karaites rather than defeating them. And this is also this idea that the Karaites were about to take over the Jewish world. It's so hard to know what the demography is. They were very strong in the land of Israel, but were they a majority, and how many people we're talking about? There's Jewish community altogether before the Crusades was very small in the land of Israel. And the boundaries never really firmly made. We have letters from the Geniza where the head of the community, the rabbinic community in Ramla, writes to people in Egypt asking for advice. He says he has a problem with these people in the shul who say, if you don't do it our way, we'll go to the Karaite shul. So that it wasn't unheard of, for a Jew in Eretz Israel in the 11th century to get up Shabbat morning and say, well, which shul am I going to go to? Am I going to go to the Karaite? Am I going to go to the Rabbinite? Just like in Egypt, in Cairo, Fustat, Old Egypt, they had three shuls to go to. They either had the Shami, the Eretz Israel shul, the Iraqi, the Babylonian shul, both rabbinic, and the Karaite shul. And there's a lot of evidence of going back and forth. The Rambam had to put out an announcement, a number of other rabbis in Cairo condemning those rabbinites who follow the laws of purity, family purity of the Karaites. So the lines were never really impermeable. And I think that's the important thing to keep in mind. It wasn't like they were considered untouchable sectarians. They were part of the Jewish community.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that. I know you say it was porous, but what's the basic ideology of the Karaites? Now, I know that's like a loaded question because what was it then in the beginning and has it changed throughout the centuries? But I guess as best we could paint like a general picture first, the basic ideology of them.
Well, if you ask about ideology, one of the questions is principles of Judaism, principles of faith. Now, the Rambam has 13 principles of faith. Most Karaites say there are 10. But if you look at Rambam's 13, Karaites can agree with 12 and a half of them. There's no problem whatsoever with the existence of God, the incorporeality of God, the unity of God, the preexistence of God, prophecy to Moses. The only thing is the Rambam says that that the Torah we have is a Torah given to Moses, both the Torah itself and its interpretation, namely the oral Torah. So that the Karaites wouldn't agree with. But in terms of their theology, reward and punishment, afterlife, resurrection, coming the Messiah, all the things that you think about as regular Jewish theology, rabbinic theology, they accept. The major ideological difference is the question, were there two Torahs given at Mount Sinai? And is the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, obligatory upon Jews. So they don't accept the interpretations which they see in the oral Torah. Many people think that Karaism is very literal, that they observe the Bible, the Torah literally, which is not true, because there are examples where, for instance, take Yibum, Levirate marriage, where the man dies and without any children, his brother has to marry or give release to the widow. Well, it says when two brothers live together, and according to Chazal, that means two biological brothers. According to the Karaites, there can't be another brother because in Vayikra there's a prohibition of a brother marrying his brother's, marrying his brother's wife. So they say Achim there, brothers doesn't mean brothers, it means relatives, not even close relatives. Or when Chazal understand you should bind it as a sign upon your hands for the tefillin, they say, no, that's not literal. Or putting on the mezuzot to put it on the doorpost of your house, they don't take that literally. So it's not a question of taking it, understanding the Torah literally. It's just an alternative interpretation of the Torah, which leads to a different halacha. But ideology, in terms of theology, for instance, is very much like rabbinic theology.
So they're basically saying they're kaifer b'Torah Shabbal Peh, so to speak, that they just argue on. They don't believe in Chazal, but they don't agree that was given from Hashem to Moshe, like you were saying. But they seem to have their own interpretation. So that what everyone thinks of the Karaites is more what the Tzedukim were, is what they probably.
Yeah. No, they have the Tzedukim also had, in a sense, their own interpretations of the halacha, and the Dead Sea Scroll people did as well. We can assume in Bayit Sheni, the Second Temple, there are many different groups that were vying for the hearts and minds of the Jewish people. The only one which survived intact after the destruction of the temple were the Pharisees, and they became rabbinic Judaism. But it wasn't always clear that they were the majority of the people. In fact, I usually compare these groups to religious parties, religious political parties, in which the biggest party, from my mind, in Second Temple period was the Amoratzim, the Amei Haaretz, the independents, the floating voters. Sometimes they'll do it by one way, sometimes they'll do it another way. But they weren't necessarily convinced that rabbinic Judaism was the Judaism. When Pharisaism survived the Second Temple and the rabbis wrote the Talmud and the other rabbinic literature of Chazal, they presented a picture in which this was always normative Judaism and everybody always listened to the rabbis. But we know that's not true, and there are various different other forms of Judaism throughout the years.
I want to get to their practices, but I realized I forgot to ask an important question. Where does the term Karaite or Karaism come from? What does it mean?
Okay, most people think that it comes from the word mikra, or scripture. It's interesting, in English we say scripture, which is something which is written, whereas in Hebrew we say mikra, which is something which is read. But since they're considered scripturalists, people who follow the Bible, the mikra, they think that's what the Karaism is. There are two other possible explanations. One is a kara in the sense of missionaries are calling out. There's a parallel among the Shiite Muslims. They also had missionaries, and the term in Islam sounds very much, its connotation-wise is the same as calling out, like Karaim. And there's also those who think that it comes from the Kruei Moed, that in the Tanakh, those were the special people that were called out in among the community, and that's why they're Karaim. But the general interpretation is that they are those who follow Mikra. Okay,
so what were their religious practices? I know you mentioned a couple here and there, but generally their overall religious practices and things that they observed on day to day, I guess.
Okay, so I'd say the best guide is to read my book. I have a full chapter on this. But we can start out with a different calendar. The rabbinic calendar, at least since it's also controversial from when, but the last calendar controversy was in the 10th century, and that was how to calculate the calendar. The calendar we use today is calculated. You can take today's calendar and know when Rosh Hashanah will be in 1,000 years from now. The Karaites say no, that you have to actually see the new moon. To make a new month, you have to see the new moon, the way it's described in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, about how the witnesses would come. And they also said that when the Torah says, Shmor et Chodesh Aviv, observe the month of Aviv, Aviv there means the barley plant. And the way to decide whether or not to make a leap year is to go out and see whether the barley is ripened in Adar. And if the barley hasn't ripened yet, you add another Adar, and then it'll be Pesach, will be the month of the Aviv. So they have a different calendar, and even though now it's more or less calculated, they do it on the basis of when they believe the new moon would be seen under the best circumstances. So usually the Karaite calendar is a day or two after the rabbinic calendar. So if Rosh Hashanah is on Thursday, oftentimes it's Friday for them. They, by the way, have only one day of the holidays, both in Israel and outside Israel. They have no postponements. The Dichiyot are rule of Lo Adu Rosh, that Rosh Hashanah cannot be on a Sunday or Wednesday or Friday. They don't accept. They say, it says in the Torah, these are Elu Modei Hashem Asher Tiru Otam B'Moadam, that you are to announce the holidays of God in their season. And we have Dichiyot so that Yom Kippur doesn't fall the day before, the day after Shabbat, and also the Hoshana Rabbah doesn't come on a Shabbat. So they said, the Torah doesn't say these are the times of the Lord unless it's inconvenient for you. These are the times of Hashem. This is when you should have the holidays. So there are no Dichiyot. The holidays can come on any day, except for Shavuot, which they understand Mimocharat Shabbat, the marrow of the Shabbat, in Vayikra to mean counting always on a Sunday. So their Shavuot is always on a Sunday. Dietary laws are different. I mentioned the meat and milk. They don't accept a blanket prohibition of meat and milk, but they do accept that the same meal, one shouldn't have meat and milk from the same species. So you could have goat milk with beef, the same meal. They don't use different utensils. They don't separate them. But so in terms of slaughtering animals, they more or less, their shechita is very much like rabbini's shechita, a different blessing, different parts of the body. They check for the kashrut to make sure it's healthy, different parts. There's always a long discussion about the fat tail. That's a part of the fat of the sheep, which Chazal allow and they forbid. Liturgy is totally different. It's not like certain branches of Judaism. You go into their synagogue, and you open the Siddur, and it looks familiar, but things are missing or things are changed. Here, the Siddur is totally different. There's no Shemona Esrei. Mostly, it's passages from Psalms, some other passages from the Tanakh. Only in the last 800 years or so did they add post-rabbinic sections to their prayers. The Psalms are not said haphazardly. There's an order to them, but it's mostly Psalms, and as at least the ones practicing Karaites today, we'll get to this later, it's very Middle Eastern sounding. They do everything responsibly, everything out loud, and mostly it's saying of Psalms. In addition, there are no chairs in the Karaite synagogue. They sit on the floor, they prostrate themselves. People say this looks very much like a mosque, but in the temple, Jews also prayed, didn't have chairs. They did full prostration, which we do 3 times a year, 2 days Rosh Hashanah, 1 day of Yom Kippur, but they do it every day. They do have seats in the back of the shul, which they call Moshev Zakenim. It's for the old people. So anybody who can't sit on the floor or prostrate themselves. Incest laws are more strict than among the rabbis. So, for instance, 2 brothers can't marry 2 sisters, or they say that since the Torah says that an aunt can't have relations with a nephew, then an uncle can't have relations with a niece. According to Chazal, uncle-niece wedding is a something to be something good, something to encourage. According to the Karaites, this would be another example of incest. Holiday practices are different. They don't blow a shofar on Rosh Hashanah. They don't use the 4 species on Sukkot. They do on Pesach. They're very, very strict about anything that could have any leaven involved, so they hardly eat anything. They don't even drink wine because wine is fermented. So that's on Pesach they don't drink wine, just grape juice made out of raisins. Shavuot, as I said, is always on Sunday, and their fast days are different days of the week or different days in the calendar, so that it's the 7th of Tammuz, it's the 7th and 10th of Av. They don't have Tani Dester. They do have the 10th of Tevet, and Tzom Gedalia instead of the 3rd of Tishrei is on the 24th of Tishrei. And basically what they say is for these are more in tune with what it says in the Bible about the siege of the first temple, and that the dates of the fast days, some of the dates of fast days in the rabbinic calendar are influenced by what happened in the second temple. They say only the first temple, and no Hanukkah, because Hanukkah is post biblical. They do have Purim, and in fact, they just celebrated Purim this past week, because it's the first Adar, but they observe Purim the first Adar. So that's some of the differences. There are a lot of things which are the same. It's certainly the moral law, in terms of the fact that the holidays look like the same holidays. The calendar is different, but it's in the same ballpark. Let me put it that way.
One question there, you mentioned the liturgy. Do they do 3 times a day, or is it only 1 time a day?
It's 2 times a day. They have one in the morning and one at sunset. So,
okay, so let's get to overall as taken as a body, the Karaites. Where did they live throughout the centuries? I mean, where were they?
Okay, so Anan was in Bavel in Iraq, and I mentioned Yaqub Bakir Kasani was a very important Iraqi Karaite. There are other Iraqi Karaites. Maybe the earliest ones were in Persia and Iran, but in the late 9th century, Daniel al-Qumasi, who's perhaps could be considered the real founder of Karaism, moved from Iran to the land of Israel, and he thought that by moving to Israel and by having other Jews move to Israel and pray for the salvation, the Geulah, the redemption, this would bring about the Mashiach. And he adopted, and his group adopted, mourning practices. They were the Avelei Tzion. They didn't eat meat or drink wine. They wore sackcloth, and they had other ascetic practices. And the land of Israel community in the late 9th to the end of the 11th century was really the Karaite Golden Age. This was the greatest Karaite intellectuals. They standardized Karaite practice. They standardized Karaite exegesis of the Torah. Their greatest exegete was Yefet ben Elia, probably mention him later. They had theologians. They had grammarians. They really had a very strong community. As I said, some people think that they were the majority, but I don't know if that's true in the land of Israel. But by 1099, when the Crusaders came, the community was already on the decline, and that really ended the Golden Age with the Crusaders. The next center was in Byzantium, today is Turkey, Constantinople or Istanbul of today. And this was a community which established in the late 10th, certainly 11th century. They send students from Constantinople to Jerusalem to study, and they brought back the texts and they translated it into Hebrew. And from the 11th century to basically the 15th, 16th century, this was the center of Karaism, the world center of Karaism. And it was during this period that there became a slow rapprochement with rabbinic Judaism. And in fact, one of the Karaites from this period, a fellow named Nisi ben Noach, is reported to have said that most of the works of the Talmud, most of the words of the Talmud are the words of our fathers. In other words, they adopted what they could of the rabbinic tradition, certainly not the halakha, but was certainly open to halakha. There were the rabbinic halakha, there were reforms. I mentioned that Anan forbid the use of fire lit before Shabbat. In the 15th century, the Karaites said, enough, we can't sit in the house in the dark. So they started lighting candles before Shabbat without a bracha. No cholent, no keeping the house heated, but at least they had light on Friday night in the house. The next stop, in a sense, was Eastern Europe, both the Crimea and Lithuania and parts of what is now Ukraine. And it's interesting that the first Karaites to get to Lithuania, wrote to the center in Constantinople and said, now that we can light candles on Erev Shabbat, how about keeping our houses warm with on Shabbat? And they got an answer back basically saying, not so terrible. You can go a day without heating, having no idea what a Lithuanian winter was like. We don't have very much evidence afterwards about this question, so I am assuming other people assume that they somehow use non-Jews to heat their houses also, because Lithuania, you can't go in the heat in the middle of the winter. Anyway, this Eastern European Karaites are the ones that eventually broke away from Judaism. It was a long process. In the 19th century, late 18th and the 19th century, they argued for tax relief from the Tsarist authorities and also the Austrian authorities, saying that the anti-Jewish laws, tax laws, shouldn't refer to them because they're a different type of Jew. And by the 20th century, they started saying they weren't Jews altogether. They weren't racially Jews. Early 20th century, of course, is a period of racial anti-Semitism, that even if one was born a Jew, conversion to some other religion didn't help one with the racial anti-Semites. So the Karaites claim that they're a Turkish people. They also spoke a vernacular, which was from the Turkish. And the Nazis indeed said they were not Jews and generally did not persecute them during World War II. But that community in Eastern Europe was the center for a while, but now they're only just small remnants. Throughout the centuries, there was a community in Egypt, and it's the Egyptian community that most of them moved to Israel after the establishment of the state. They didn't leave right away, but as the relations between Egypt and Israel deteriorated, there was also, in 1953, there was an Israeli plot to bomb American institutions in Egypt to ruin the relation between Egypt and Egypt and the United States. It was called the Lavon Affair. 2 Egyptian Jews were executed as part of this plot. One of them was a Karaite. So life for Jews in Egypt was not tenable anymore. Most of them moved to Israel. Most of the Karaites in Israel today are of Egyptian origin. They're also in the Bay Area in San Francisco, in California. There's a Karaite community, and then there's small communities still in Istanbul. Some, I said, in Eastern Europe, where some of them are trying to get back to Jewish roots. Some of them are trying, at least. Lausanne, Paris, Marseille, but these are all very, very small communities.
How connected were all these communities? Like you mentioned, the Egyptian ones, the Eastern European, the ones in Turkey. How were they like? Was it like, similar to we have Ashkenazim and Sephardim and different things like that, or were they sometimes they were totally different and their practices just completely different?
No, their practices were generally the same, and we know from pilgrims. For instance, pilgrims started in Eastern Europe and Lithuania. On their way to the land of Israel, they would stop off in Istanbul to see the communities there. Also, they would raise money. Communities, when one community was in trouble, they'd point to another community. The Egyptian community imported rabbis, either their rabbi, then they call them their chachamim rabbis, either from the what used to be this Byzantine community, Istanbul Ottoman community, or from Crimea. So there's a lot of relationship between them. With the after World War II and the Soviet Union, and the fact that Karaites were denying any Jewish relationship, they sort of broke off contact with Karaites in other places of the world. And when the Egyptian Karaites, either from America or from Israel, went to visit them when the Soviet Union fell, the local Karaites didn't know what to make of each other, because they were by then they were so far away in their practice and their outlook. The one other thing is that they were always in touch with each other. Okay, so one example of this relationship is there's one of my guys. I wrote a book of edited his writings. Simply Yitzchak Lutsky was from Lutsk in what was then Volhynia, is now part of Ukraine. Moved from there to Crimea, and he didn't like the way things were done there, and there was calendar controversies always occur. So he wrote to the Egyptian Karaites asking how they did things, so that he could point out to the locals that what they were doing was wrong. So there, until the modern period, the contemporary period, there were always relations between these Karaite communities.
Okay, so and one other thing about these communities, I mean, what were the numbers that we were talking about at the height of these communities? I guess this is like in each place throughout the centuries. Do we have even? I don't know if we have specific numbers. We have generalities. How are they? Big, small?
It's very. First of all, they're always small. Maybe in the land of Israel, and there was a sizable community in Egypt, but even if you look at Rashi, I mean, what was Rashi's community? It had 10 families, 12 families. I mean, that's. So there's never large numbers. In the beginning of the 20th century, Tsarist Russia had a census. I think at the time they came up with about 7,000 or 10,000 Karaites, meaning all together in all the different places in the part of the Tsarist Empire, from Lithuania to the Crimea. The numbers that came from Egypt, again, we don't know for sure. People ask me today how many there are, and part of the problem of determining how many Karaites there are is determining who is a Karaite. And it's not always clear, because you have intermarriage between Karaite Jews and Rabbinite Jews. And there are Karaites who try to pass as just normal secular Israelis. I think the most reliable guesstimate is up to 50,000, or not even half a percent of worldwide Jewry. So we're talking about small numbers. In the past, they were, when the communities were stronger and centralized, whether it was in the land of Israel or Constantinople, they were more significant. Also in the Crimean Peninsula, it appears that the majorities were Karaite Jews. In Troki, in Lithuania, there seem to be more Karaites than Rabbinites. But again, the numbers are very small.
No, what were their connections between the Karaites and, as you call as rabbinic Jews, throughout the centuries?
Well, at first it was antagonism. It was a competition. By the end of the Golden Age, at the end of the 11th century in the land of Israel, I think it was pretty clear to everyone the Karaites would be a minority. But there's still influence. There's still they knew each other. They read each other's works. Mostly Karaites read most of the rabbinite works. I have an article about Maimonides, how Maimonides turned into a cultural hero among the Karaites, how the Karaites read rabbinic literature, especially in Eastern Europe. In the time of printing, there are very few printed Karaite books because of the cost of printing and the few number of consumers. So if they wanted to read Jewish books, they would read printed rabbinite books. There are a number of Karaites, as I mentioned, Yefa ben Eli, he's cited quite a number of times in Abraham Ibn Ezra's commentaries to the Bible. And it's interesting, the Art Scroll series, which does not want to quote any non-authoritative Jews, often mentions Yefes in their commentary to the Torah, obviously taken from Ibn Ezra and probably not knowing who Yefes was. I mentioned also Isaac of Troki wrote a book called Chizuk Emunah, which was Faith Strengthened, which was a major anti-Christian polemic at the end of the 16th century. And this became a bestseller among all Jews, translated into Yiddish, into Ladino, into English and other European languages. And there was no Karaite content to the book, so it was read and very popular among rabbinite Jews. There were areas where in Constantinople, when Benjamin Tudela got there in the 12th century, he said there was a fence in between the Karaite and rabbinite areas. There sometimes was nastiness, but for many periods of Jewish history, they were considered part of the Jewish body politic. Certainly in countries with an Islamic rulership, they considered the Karaite Jews and Rabbinite Jews to be two branches of the same Judaism. They didn't see a difference between them, even as Egypt up till the modern period. So there was knowledge of it. Now, with the Karaites, are such a small group that there's almost no Karaite impact on rabbinic Judaism, and people don't know they still exist. They have no, they said, no impact upon the larger Jewish community.
So was there ever, I guess a minority of a minority, but were there ever any that were switching communities? I know you mentioned the story where people would go daven in different shuls, but was there ever really, how really switch communities? Either way, I guess.
Well, I would love for there to be a conversion story. I would love that in 11th century, somebody wrote and said, I used to be a rabbinite, but I had such a great desire to have cheeseburgers that I became a Karaite. And we don't have such stories. And that's part of the problem with the question of the origins. Some people present it as if when Karaism arose, it was so attractive that rabbinite Jews ran to it. But we have no indication that's true. We don't know who the first Karaites were, who their parents were, who their grandparents were. And formal conversion. There's really no formal conversion as such. The only problems that rabbinic Jews have with the Karaites and the Karaites with the rabbinic Jews is a question of marriageability. Because if you have a different get, which they have, and if you have different laws of incest and forbidden relations, you might have a problem with future generations of Mamzei Root. And there are various different solutions to this problem. The Radbaz in the 16th century poskin that the Karaite marriages were not authentic marriages, and therefore they didn't need a get. But there apparently was always transitions. There was always intermarriage. We have from the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza, we have Ketubot, the marriage contracts, which are, some of them are basically prenuptial agreements between a Karaite and a Rabbinite as to whose holidays they would observe, whose kashrut they would observe, whose laws of menstrual purity they would observe. So they determine in advance how to get along with each other. So formal conversion, no. Changing denominations, apparently there was, but not to a great extent.
Okay, so something else that I wanted to discuss, it was a famous Karaites. I know you mentioned a couple. We mentioned Yafet Ben Eli, who I should mention that some of his commentaries have been printed by published new editions by Bar-Ilan University Press, I believe. And also there was Isaac of Troki, and you mentioned also Furkovich. I don't know if you want to discuss a little bit more about them or any other famous figures, so to speak.
Well, fame is a fleeting thing, and it's also relative. The first people think of Anan as the first Karaite, which he wasn't. Then you have Benjamin of Nahawandi, was the first one to use the term Karaite, and Daniel Al-Kumasi. In the 10th and 11th century, you had really great intellectuals, just some of Yusuf al-Basir, Yosef Haroeh, who apparently is called Haroeh, the seer, because he was blind. You had grammarians, Abu Harun, who was known in the West as the Jerusalem grammarian among rabbinic Jews, writing about him, didn't want to mention his name, but called him the Jerusalem grammarian. You have two Aarons, Aaron ben Joseph and Aaron ben Elijah. You have Elijah Bashachi, but all these names did not make an impact upon rabbinic Judaism. The only one, as I said, the bestseller was Isaac of Troki. Abraham Firkovich is known both as a forger. He forged tombstones, he forged manuscripts in order to make Karaites seem to be older and more important. In 20th century, perhaps the most important Karaite is a guy named Sariah Shapshal. He was the one who convinced all the Karaites to say they weren't Jews, they had no relationship to Jews. Today, you have some Karaite leaders in the community, and there is in Eastern Europe, there was a Karaite woman who was ambassador to a number of different countries, but no, I'd say, household names that anyone in the rabbinic Jewish community would recognize.
Yeah, I probably should have said important figures, not famous figures. I guess that would have been a better term.
Okay. All right. So in the context of Karaism, you have the exegetes, the Mefarshim, you have Ben Eli, and Aaron ben Elijah, Aaron ben Yosef, the halachis, Elijah Basyachi, person I've been working on, I have a book also on him, a part of a text, Judah Hadassi, 12th century in Constantinople, who wrote a book called Eshkoa Kofer, which is composed of almost 400 acrostics, alphabetical acrostics, Aleph to Taf and then Taf to Aleph, every stanza ending with the syllable Cha, Adonecha, Elohecha, Amecha. It's an amazing book full of both halacha and also polemics against rabbinites, polemics against other religions, folk tales, wonders, bestiaries describing wonderful animals. It's a very, very important work. It's one of the classics of Hebrew literature. He wrote it in Hebrew. The ones previous Karaites in the land of Israel wrote in Judeo-Arabic. After that, some of them were writing this Turkish language when Rabbinite Jews were using Yiddish. So there's certainly, the Karaites could look back on their own chain of tradition with quite a number of prominent people from the Karaite point of view.
Okay, so finally, the last question I would ask is, I mean, why should a frum person, as the Karaites would say, a rabbinic Jew, but a frum person, why should they care about the Karaites or their practices? How is this relevant to them?
Okay, so first of all, anybody interested in Jewish history should be aware of Karaism and the place of Karaism in Jewish history. In the Middle Ages, many Rabbinite Jews reacted to Karaism in various different ways. If you look at the Kuzari, Judah Levi's Kuzari, about a tenth of the book is dedicated to anti-Karaite polemic. If you don't know who the Karaites are, you don't understand what the polemic is. Rambam has a very interesting relation with the Karaites. He adopted some Karaite views, then the Karaites adopted them. And I think it's important to know also the challenge that the Karaites presented to rabbinic Judaism. I mean, their arguments against the Mishnah, the arrogance against the Torah Sheba'al Peh, modern frum rabbinic Jew is not going to accept them, but at least should be aware that these arguments exist and be able to strengthen his own belief or her own belief on the basis of figuring out how to answer these challenges. And throughout rabbinic Jewish history, there are responses to those who reject the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and among the rabbinic Jews, different understandings of Torah Sheba'al Peh, from Rav Saadia Gaon, who saw it as maximalistic, including everything, and the Rambam in his introduction to the Mishnah really gives a minimalist approach to Torah Sheba'al Peh. In the early modern period, we had sort of modern Karaites, not real Karaites, but for instance, returning conversos, the Jews who were converted in Spain, who came to Western Europe and converted and didn't know what rabbinic Judaism was about. So we have the Kuzari Hasheni, Rabbi Nieto, which is also, in a sense, a defense of Torah Shabbat Peh, the oral Torah. And I think in general that if one wants to understand how Judaism is developed and how rabbinic Judaism has understood itself, one has to understand the opponents of rabbinic Judaism, and the most important opponent of rabbinic Judaism through the years has been the Karaites.
Okay, so I will put a link in the show's notes to where people can purchase the book if they want to, like you said, read more about it. It's all in there. And thank you very much for joining me to come on the podcast to talk about that.
You're welcome, and it was a pleasure being with you.